The iron gates of the upper district slammed shut with a sound like a guillotine blade slicing through the heart of the city. It was a quiet Tuesday, and the bells of the great cathedral tolled 3 times, not for a wedding, but for a funeral no one knew had begun. While the markets buzzed with trade, massive iron bolts slid into place, sealing the fate of thousands. Why do those with everything to lose always sense the shadow before it falls, while the rest are left to wonder why the sun feels so cold? There is a recurring pattern in the archives of our history, a chilling cycle that repeats whenever the air turns heavy with the scent of an approaching storm. It is a story not of medicine or biology, but of the invisible lines we draw between one another when survival becomes the only currency that matters. Some call it a tragedy, others call it a tactical necessity, but in the whispered corners of the old world, it is known as the Great Betrayal. It is the moment when the social contract is shredded, not by the desperate, but by those who have the most to protect. We must look closely at the stones of the past, for they often hold the blueprints for our future. The city of Aethelgard once stood as a monument to human achievement, divided into rings that spiraled outward from a center of gold and marble. In the inner ring, the air was always perfumed, and the fountains never ceased their rhythmic dance. But in the outer rings, where the workers lived in the shadow of the great walls, life was a symphony of labor and dust. For centuries, the two worlds existed in a delicate balance, a symbiotic relationship where the poor provided the hands and the rich provided the vision. However, visions tend to blur when a threat emerges that cannot be bought, bargained with, or ignored. The architecture of the city was designed for harmony, but it was built for exclusion. The first signs were subtle, almost ghostly. A sudden silence in the northern docks where the ships usually jostled for space. A series of houses in the cramped tenements marked with a simple, hurried piece of charcoal. In the beginning, the voices from the gilded towers spoke of unity. High-ranking officials stood on balconies, their voices amplified by the city's architecture, promising that the resources of the state would be deployed to protect every citizen. They spoke of a collective shield and a shared destiny. They promised that the granaries were full and the physicians were ready. But as the shadows lengthened and the reports of an unseen guest grew more frequent, the tone in the inner ring shifted from public assurance to private fortification. It began with the movement of carriages under the veil of night. Long lines of black lacquered coaches began to stream out of the city gates while the rest of the world slept. The wealthy were not merely traveling. They were relocating to their mountain estates, their fortified villas, and their secluded islands. They carried with them the granary's best harvests, the city's finest physicians, and the keys to the kingdom's reserves. It was a silent exodus performed with the precision of a military maneuver. While the common folk were told to stay in their homes and wait for instructions that would never come, the very people who issued those instructions were already miles away, watching the city skyline from the safety of their balconies. By the time the sun rose on the third day, the reality of the situation hit the streets like a physical blow. The bridges connecting the districts had been dismantled or blocked by heavy iron grates. The guards, who once patrolled the streets to maintain order, were now stationed at the borders of the wealthy enclaves, their spears pointed outward, glinting in the morning light. The message was clear: the safety of the few outweighed the survival of the many. The unseen guest had arrived, and instead of a shield, the poor found themselves facing a wall of iron and indifference. The streets that once hummed with the sounds of commerce were now filled with the sound of locked doors and muffled weeping. The conflict was not just physical, it was a psychological severance that cut deeper than any blade. In the sunken alleys, the realization set in like a cold frost. They were left to navigate the darkness alone, with no medicine, no leadership, and no hope of escape. The very systems designed to protect them, the supply chains, the law, the communal spirit, had been repurposed into a cage. The rich did not just leave, they actively ensured that those left behind could not follow. Roads were sabotaged, horses were seized, and the local wells in the outer districts were mysteriously boarded up to prevent contamination, leaving the residents with no choice but to face the encroaching shadow with empty hands. One might wonder how such a betrayal is justified in the minds of those who commit it. Historical fragments suggest a terrifying logic used by those behind the walls. In the letters found in abandoned estates years later, the elite wrote of preserving the spark of civilization. They argued that if everyone were allowed to flee, the affliction would spread like wildfire, consuming the entire world. By sacrificing the outer rings, they claimed to be creating a firebreak. They saw themselves not as cowards, but as the keepers of the future, stewards of a flame that could only be kept alive if the excess was allowed to burn away. It is a dark philosophy that treats human lives as a statistical necessity rather than a moral obligation. As the situation intensified, the measures became even more drastic. When the residents of the Sunken Alleys tried to plead for help at the gates of the inner ring, they were met with silence or the terrifying finality of the flame. To protect their sanitized zones, the overseers ordered the peripheral villages to be razed. They called it containment. They claimed they were cleansing the areas to stop the guest from moving further, but the people who lived there saw it for what it was, the erasure of the inconvenient. The night sky over Aethelgard turned a dull, bruised orange as the homes of the laborers were turned to ash, a desperate attempt by the powerful to put a barrier of heat between themselves and the discomfort of reality. The air in the city became a thick veil of suspicion. Every cough was a potential death sentence, every knock on the door a threat to one's own dwindling safety. But the greatest threat wasn't the sickness itself. It was the neighbor who would trade your life for a day's worth of rations, or the official who would look the other way while your entire district was cordoned off and forgotten. The betrayal had trickled down from the towers to the gutters. When the people at the top abandoned their responsibility, the foundation of trust below them inevitably crumbles. The poor were not just dying from the unseen guest, they were dying from the sudden, absolute absence of humanity. In the midst of this desolation, a strange and unexpected thing happened. In the sunken alleys where the abandonment was absolute, the people began to build their own systems of survival. Without the guidance of the elite, they shared what little they had left. They created their own signals, their own herbal remedies, and their own codes of conduct. They realized that the gold locked away in the inner ring had no value when the world stopped turning. The very people who had been discarded like refuse were the ones who held each other's hands in the dark. It was a fragile, desperate kind of unity, born from the recognition that they were all that remained of the city's soul. While the fires burned in the distance, the people of the alleys learned to look for the light in each other's eyes rather than the light of the cathedral. They shared soup made from scraps and stories made from memory. They realized that the walls meant to keep them out had also, in a strange way, set them free from the illusions of the old world. They were no longer subjects of a crown or workers for a guild. They were survivors of a shared shadow. But this unity was constantly tested by the hunger and the encroaching silence that claimed the streets, house by house. Meanwhile, behind the high walls of the mountain estates, the wealthy lived in a state of gilded paranoia. They had the food, the wine, and the medicine, but they also had the crushing weight of their own choices. They looked at one another with narrowed eyes, wondering who among them would be the next to be cast out if the shadow managed to slip past their guards. They had built a world of walls, only to find that they were trapped inside them. They had preserved their lives, but in the process, they had forgotten how to live. Every shadow on the wall looked like a vengeful ghost from the city they had burned to the ground. Their luxury was a cage of their own making. The Great Betrayal serves as a chilling mirror to our own nature. It asks a question that most of us are afraid to answer. If the world were to tilt on its axis tomorrow, would we be the ones holding the gate open or the ones sliding the bolt home? We like to believe in our collective progress, in the strength of our modern institutions, and in the inherent goodness of our neighbors. But history whispers a different truth. It tells us that when a threat becomes existential, the thin veneer of civilization can peel away in a matter of hours, revealing a much older and hungrier instinct. It is an instinct that does not recognize faces, only threats and assets. The story of Aethelgard is not a confirmed fact, but a warning echoed across centuries. It is found in the ruins of ancient empires and the panicked headlines of the modern age. It is the story of the Great Divide, where the value of a life is determined by the size of a fortress or the depth of a vault. The real tragedy of the betrayal was not the lives lost to the sickness, but the realization that the people who were supposed to lead the way were the first to run. They were the architects of the very walls that became their neighbors' tombs. We must ask ourselves if our own modern towers are built with the same secret exits. As the years passed and the shadow eventually lifted, the elite returned to the city. They walked through the silent streets of the outer rings with silk handkerchiefs held over their noses, lamenting the unfortunate losses and the necessary sacrifices that had been made for the greater good. They rebuilt the markets and the bridges, and they spoke of a new era of prosperity. They even erected a monument to the fallen, a grand stone pillar in the center of the Sunken Alleys. They used the finest marble, inscribed with words of honor and remembrance. But the people who survived did not look at the monument. They looked at the gates of the inner ring, and they remembered the sound of the bolt sliding home. They remembered the nights when the only light came from the fires of their own homes, set by the hands of those who claimed to be their protectors. They remembered the silence of the great cathedral bells that refused to ring for them when they needed hope the most. And they realized that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a contagion or a famine. It is the moment a human being decides that another person is disposable. The unseen guest eventually went away, but the betrayal remained, etched into the very stones of the city and the hearts of those who walked its streets. The trust that had taken centuries to build was gone in a single season of shadows. This mystery of the human heart remains unsolved. We continue to build our cities with inner and outer rings, sometimes with walls of stone and sometimes with walls of digital code, economic policy, or social standing. We tell ourselves that we are different now, that we have learned from the shadows of the past, and that our empathy is stronger than our fear. But somewhere deep in the archives of our shared memory, the bells are still tolling. The gates are still waiting to be shut. Every time we prioritize our own comfort over another's survival, we add another stone to that ancient wall. Perhaps the true measure of a civilization is not how it flourishes in the sun, but how it behaves in the dark. If we are willing to sacrifice the many to save the few, can we truly say we have survived at all? Or have we simply become the very thing we were trying to escape? The chronicles of the Great Betrayal offer no easy answers, only a cold reflection of a possibility we must strive to prevent. Because in the end, when the lights go out and the doors are locked, we are all just residents of the Sunken Alleys, waiting for a hand that may never come. The darkness does not discriminate, but the gatekeepers do. The echoes of Aethelgard serve as a haunting reminder that the greatest threat to our future isn't a lack of resources or a biological anomaly. It is the fragility of our empathy. It is the ease with which we can turn our backs on those who built the very walls we hide behind. As we look toward the horizon of our own uncertain times, we must ask ourselves if we are building bridges or if we are sharpening the spears. The Great Betrayal is not a single event in time. It is a choice that is made every day, in every hall of power and on every city street. It is a choice between the comfort of the fortress and the vulnerability of the community. The story ends not with a resolution, but with a lingering silence. A silence that invites us to look at the people around us and wonder what their faces would look like in the orange glow of a containment fire. It challenges us to consider if we are truly part of a collective, or if we are just individuals waiting for the bell to toll so we can run for the gates. The shadow is always there, moving just beyond the edge of our vision, testing the strength of the bonds we claim to cherish. And until we can ensure that no one is left like a mouse in the dark, the Great Betrayal will continue to be a chapter of our history that remains perpetually open. We must remember the sound of the iron gates. We must remember the smell of the charcoal on the doors, for if we forget, we are destined to hear that sound again. The bells of the great cathedral are silent for now, but the gears of the inner ring are always kept well oiled. The question is not if the shadow will return, but who will be standing next to you when it does. Will we be the ones sliding the bolt, or will we be the ones holding the door open for everyone? History is watching, and the gates are always waiting.